Hello everyone and welcome. In this video, I'm going to teach you the difference between iterators and iterables in Python, as well as how you can create your own custom iterator objects manually using Python. So let's get into it. Now, I understand there may be a lot of confusion surrounding the concept of iterator, but hopefully after you watch this video, you'll get a good understanding of it. So an iterable is really easy. An iterable is basically just something that you can loop over. So I have a list called X here with a list of numbers. Now this list is an iterable because of course I can loop over it, right? So the way I'd do that is with a for loop. So I would write for num in X and then print that num. And now if I run this code, you can see that this is going to print all of the numbers in my list. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But have you ever wondered exactly how a for loop works? Because a for loop actually performs a bunch of operations in the background that we don't see, right? And that's where the concept of iterator comes in. Now, an iterator is basically something that can keep track of where it is during an iteration, can retrieve the next value, knows what the next value is, and knows when to stop the iteration. Now, the first thing that a for loop does behind the scenes, so in the background, is actually to turn your iterable object, the thing you're looping over, into an iterator object. Now I'm going to delete this so that you can understand it better. Now there is a way to create iterators manually. So I would just create a variable called y, and then this is going to be equal calling the iter_dunder method on my iterable x. So I would write x dot double underscore iter double underscore and then parenthesis. And now y is equal to an iterator object that was created from my iterable x. So I know this may sound a bit confusing, but stick with me. I'm sure you'll understand it after I explain in this video. So my iterator object is created. So my object y, if I were to loop over it, it would know exactly what it is during the iteration, knows how to get the next value, and knows when to stop the iteration, right? But now this doesn't really do anything yet. I have to actually call another method on my iterator object in order for it to retrieve values, okay? So that is going to be the next method. So to do that, I would just write print and then y dot double underscore next double underscore and then parenthesis. And now if I run this code, you can see that this is going to retrieve the first number in my iterable list. In my iterable x. So that would be 1, right? And now if I do this a couple more times, more exactly 5 times, which is the amount of elements in my list, and I click run, this is going to give me all of the values of my list, just like using a for loop would. Now, one thing that I have to mention before we move on is calling the iter method and the next method is identical to calling the iter and next functions. So instead of calling this method, if I were to write, for example, iter x, and I run this code, you can see that it's exactly the same as calling the method and the next method as well. So I'd write the function next and then y in there. And now if I run that, it's exactly the same thing as you can see. But now I mentioned as well that the iterator object knows when to stop the iteration. Now the reason it knows when to stop is because when there aren't any more objects to return, any more elements to return, it's going to reach an exception called stop iteration. So just for you to see, if I copy this one more time and I paste it one more time and I run this, this is going to give me a stop iteration exception because there aren't any more values in my iterable to return, right? So this is what a for loop does in the background, right? It takes an iterable, it turns it into an iterator, and then it calls the next method repeatedly in order to retrieve all of the elements in the iterator. And then when it reaches a stop iteration exception, it knows it's time to stop the loop, and the loop ends and the values are retrieved. Okay, so I hope that was easy to understand. Nevertheless, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. And now, in the beginning, I mentioned that I was going to teach you how to create your own custom iterator objects manually in Python. So that's what I'm going to do right now. So imagine that there is no range function, right? There is no range function and you need to implement that functionality manually. So to do that, I'm going to create a new class. So class called range. And I'm going to define the functionalities that an object of the range class can perform. So I'm going to start by defining the init method. And in here, I'm going to put myself and then start and then end. So these are going to be the start value and then the end value. And then I'm going to return all of the numbers in between those two values, just like a normal range function would. So I'm going to write self dot first. So this is going to be my first value. This is going to equal start. And then self dot last is going to equal end. Okay, so that's my init method. Now, an iterator object needs two methods like I explained previously. It needs an iter method and it needs a next method. So that's what I'm going to implement right now. Let's start by the iter method. I'm going to write def iter, and here I'm going to pass in self, and then in here I'm going to return self. Now, why am I returning self inside of this iter method? So, like I mentioned before, an iterator is an iterator because it has two specific methods, the iter method and the next method. Now, inside of my class, I am implementing both of those methods. So when I create an instance of this class, the object that I'm going to create already has those two methods, and so it is already an iterator. And that's exactly what the iter method does, right? It returns an iterator. So what I want this function to do is I want it to return the iterator which I created, which is going to be self, so the object I created. Okay, so now I'm going to get into the next method. So I'm going to write def and then next, and then I'm going to pass in self in here. And well, actually, this makes more sense to be value instead of first. You'll understand why just now in a second. Okay, so in here, I'm going to code all of the functionalities of my range function, basically. So I'm going to start by coding the moment where the iteration is supposed to stop. So where my range object is supposed to stop retrieving values. And that would be when we reach a stop iteration. Now we're going to reach a stop iteration exception when the value that we're currently going to retrieve is greater than or equal to this last value that we want. So I'm going to write if self.value, which is the value we're currently on, is greater than or equal to self.last, the last value, then I want to stop iteration. So raise stop iteration, like that. So this is going to stop the iteration when there aren't any more values to retrieve. Otherwise, I want to return the current value, right? So I'm going to actually create a variable called self.currentValue. So this is going to equal self.value because self.value right now is equal to the current value that we're on. And then I'm going to increment self.value by 1, like that. And then I'm going to return self.current value. Okay, so what this does is basically it stores the value that we're currently on, self.value, in this variable right here, self.currentValue. It increments self.value by 1, so it gets to the next value of my range function, and then it returns the current value that we're on. So that would be current value. Okay, so now let me show you that this works. I'm going to create an instance of this class called range. So range is going to equal range. And then in here, I'm going to pass in a start. My start is going to be 0. My end is going to be 4. So this is going to, well, if everything is working correctly, this is going to retrieve the numbers 0, 1, 2, and 3. Now, to actually do that, I have to call this next function on my range object. So I'm going to print next, and then in here I'm going to put my range object, and I'm going to do this a couple times like that. And now let me run this. Okay, so everything is working. You can see that when we call the next function on my range object 3 times, it gets the first 3 values, so 0, 1, and 2. And now let's do this a couple more times. So, well, actually just one more time to see if the stop iteration is working. Oh, sorry, actually twice because 0 counts. So like that. And now if I run this, okay, this is going to raise stop iteration. So we have successfully created our iterator object. Now, instead of calling the next function repeatedly on range, we can do something much easier, which is just using a for loop. So for num in range, print num. And now if I run this, you can see that everything works correctly. So we get 0, 1, 2, and 3. And now if I do this with different numbers, so for example 11, this is going to give me all of the numbers from 0 to 10. Now, there is another way to create custom iterators. Well, it isn't actually a different way. It's just a way with different functionalities, which is called a generator. Now, if you want to learn about generators, I am going to be posting a video about it soon, so stay tuned for that, because a generator is a more complex concept, and so it deserves a video just reserved to talk about that. Okay, so that's it for this video. I hope it was easy to understand. If you learned something, if this was valuable to you, please like and subscribe to help support the channel. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask, and I'll see you in the next video.